Hej och välkomna till Kornhall Netz, Skolpodden som vi gör i samarbete med tankesmedjan Arena Idé. Och det är jag, Ingela Netz, konsult inom organisation, utbildning, ledarskap. Och Per Kornhall, hej Per.
Hej Ingela. Vad trevligt att vara i samma rum.
Ja, men eller hur?
Ja. Vad jag gör, jag är ju halvtid ordförande för läromedelsförfattarna och den andra halvtiden så är jag också konsult ibland åt EU-kommissionen bland annat och sedan så skriver jag böcker och håller föredrag och så vidare.
And we're doing this in front of a live audience at Research Ed Scandinavia in Haninge. It's Saturday, March 15th. And I will switch a bit from Swedish to English in the introduction, and then we will turn all to English because we have a guest. We are really happy that you are in the room, but we presume you're not here for us, you're here for our guest. Welcome, Pedro de Bruyckere.
Hey, good morning.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm fine, a bit tired. I arrived last night, midnight, so had a very short sleep, but I'm okay. Thank you.
Good.
How are you?
I'm fine.
Thank you.
I'm fine. You are not only a speaker at this conference, but you're also an educational researcher from University of Utrecht in
Correct.
Belgium. And to us here in Sweden, you're probably most famous for a book that was launched in 2017 called Urban Myths About Learning and Education. In Swedish, it's good to know, urban myths could translate with vandringssägner. And this topic was actually one of our focuses when we were hosting Eva Hartell, who is the chair or the one who's arranging this conference just a month ago.
Yes.
So how come, Pedro, teachers and policymakers and leaders in education who are supposed to know the most about education and learning sometimes get so stuck with urban myths that they can stay on for decades?
Well, I think there can be several reasons, because some of the things we know now that are incorrect are not that practical or effective. Once were also taught in colleges and also taught at conferences like this. For instance, learning styles, to take a classic example, has been around for a long time, and in cognitive psychology, people were convinced that it could work. And sometimes we have been doing this now for 15 years. I'm getting really old. And we saw, for instance, take growth mindset. Growth mindset is not really a myth. We discussed in our second book. It wasn't translated into Swedish. But we saw it, how it became bigger and bigger, and how people started making claims about growth mindset that Carol Dweck even herself never did. And so people like to share positive examples. People like to share things that they are convinced it works. And so things keep growing and keeps living on. And at the same time, for instance, the myth busting that we do, actually Casper, Paul and I are trying to update the myth book, which is a very difficult task. And we try to check if something is still a myth. It could change, you know. Science is always the current knowledge, and knowledge can evolve. I've got good news for you. Most of the stuff that we wrote in the first book is still incorrect. Okay, but still, yeah, and if it's such a big job for us, teachers are very busy doing their job, teaching. Policymakers need to have advisors around them to read all this kind of stuff. But even for us, and it's our job to do this, sometimes it's a very complicated thing to check. I know, for instance, the learning pyramid. That learning pyramid literally took 1 month of my life away, trying to figure out...
To debunk it.
To debunk it. Mm-hmm. And I hope teachers don't spend a month trying to debunk the learning pyramid, because somebody did it already.
But it isn't also that some of these very persistent myths are intuitively, they're easy to kind of grasp, to see intuitively. They seem to be correct, but only that the effects are not. I mean,
And sometimes there is. I once wrote a series of columns with there's some truth in every lie, and for instance, do people have different preferences of learning? Yes, some people think I have to write this down, but then that's a grain of truth in the learning style myth. Yeah. We know from research that adapting to that preference doesn't have much effect, because it's more related to the topic you are reading, because the things that an image you need to remember as an image. You won't remember a description of the image. But that's already a bit more counterintuitive than the idea, you know what, I've written it down, I got great results. Yes, it works. I think maybe something strange to say, but I think the positive experiences can sometimes be more dangerous than the negative ones. Let me explain this. A couple of years ago, I was at also research at conference, but somewhere else around the globe. And there was one school giving a talk about how successful their open space plan school was. Now, we know from research that it has a negative effect. Actually, if you have an open space plan school for young children, then inequality will rise. But that school was a success, and they had data. So instead of me telling them, you are spreading a myth, I sat down with them and listened for over an hour and a half to everything they've changed in the school to introduce that open space in their education. And then I heard a lot of things that we know from research that actually can have a huge effect. For instance, the collective teacher efficacy among that team was enormous. So it could well be that if they didn't change to an open plan and did all the rest, that their pupils would have learned even more. But it could also be the case that they needed to change to that open plan to have all the other things. But now you are sitting in a conference just like this. You listen to the story about the open plan. You don't hear anything else they've done. And you just copy that one thing that they thought that made the difference. And then myths are introduced.
It's very similar to what happened in a small school in the south of Sweden, in Nossebro school, where they introduced a lot of changes, and they turned around the school very dramatically. Mm-hmm. Because they were the one and only school in that municipality, they rose like a rocket in national statistics. Mm-hmm. Okay, so they were very visible with this. But that was also, they did so many things. But the one thing that was brought out in Sweden from that school was inclusion at all costs, in every classroom. But nobody really cared about all the other dimensions that they actually work with. And speaking to them, they said, don't do like we did, because they had actually no idea of what of all of the things they did that had made a turnover. Because they had only done things, right?
And you can't blame teachers, and I will never blame teachers to believe myths. Because, there was a study, I don't know the reference by heart, but during 60 minutes of teaching, a teacher needs to make 40 unprepared decisions.
Yeah.
Which is a lot. So you have to react in a blink of an eye, 40 times an hour. Well, at that time, you want easy answers. Mm. You want to fall back at something you can be sure of. Mm. And then it's easy to believe something, oh yeah, but my colleague said that worked. Let's do this.
Or an authoritarian figure in teacher education said, this is the truth.
Yeah.
So why would you question it when you're in the classroom?
And I'm thinking, you mentioned stories, and I'm making a connection from simplifying things to storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
Because we all know that hearing a story from someone who was successful, or something that goes right into your heart when it comes to teaching younger kids or adults as well, that's what you want to hear. And you simplify, your brain simplifies because you want the quick and simple answer to.
And two other elements, you have a mechanism we call confirmation bias.
Yep.
If that story connects to something you already believe in, yeah, good, I knew it. and the other element is a kind of relatedness to somebody. Oh, I want to be as successful. But sometimes it can just be because that person is very charismatic. For instance, last week in Flanders, I shouldn't tell this story, but I've already started.
We're storytelling.
Our Minister of Education went to London to visit a lot of schools together with a lot of heads of education, and they visited also Michaela. Michaela is known as the strictest school in England. And I visited that school too, and it's impressive. I don't want to put my children in such a school, but what they are doing against inequality is great. I've met the headmistress a couple of times. I had a lot of discussion most of the times because she says I'm evidence-based. And then sometimes I dare to ask when somebody is saying they are working evidence-based, show me the evidence. And for instance, group work wasn't allowed when I visit. And then I don't know any evidence that says group work never works. But if I look to that school, I think it's an educated guess. And it's an opinion. It's not a fact, to be clear, because I don't want to start a myth myself. Is that a large part of the success of that school is a charismatic school leader. Because they have a clear vision, they have a clear leader. You won't be working there by accident. So you have a very dedicated team. Those are all elements that contribute to success. But if you want to copy it, but you don't have the same leader quality present, good luck. It can have a good effect, but maybe not in the way that school has been doing. And maybe the most difficult thing we know in education is upscaling. Because you can have a great project, and you do research in that project, and it will have a huge effect. Yeah, but everybody in the project was convinced about the project. If you then start to copy it with people who didn't buy into it, but are obliged to do it, you get a very different dynamic.
Yeah. We've seen a lot of results on that from the boost from mathematics, a project we had in Sweden, for example. So, but if society wants to support teachers not to fall into modern myths, because it's difficult for teachers to have the time, but how could society support, or how could the researcher society, or what kind of instruments should we have in our school systems?
Well, we are trying. For instance, I'm now you mentioned that I'm working at the University of Utrecht, but that's only 1 day a week. But a couple of years ago, I was asked by the Belgian government, the Flemish government, because education is regional, to start a Flemish version of the Education Endowment Foundation. In the UK, you have the Education Endowment Foundation, and they need to, it's kind of what works clearinghouse, trying to give an overview of not what works, but what could work. Because if you discuss what works in education, you make it a recipe. And if you go to biomedicine, you get a leaflet. And what they are doing and what we are doing is rewrite the leaflets for everything you can do in education. And if you buy medicine, you will see, yes, this is great against headache, but don't take it when you're pregnant. And that is something we need for teachers. That's something we need for policymakers. Yes, for instance, if you abolish homework, you say homework is forbidden. You need to know, okay, that's a good thing to fight inequality, but you have to bear in mind that homework is a low-cost, effective tool for learning. So it's true in leaflet. We know from research that if you are having children in your classroom who can't do homework at home because they are living in a one-room apartment with 5 children, with parents who don't speak the language, then homework will be a burden for those children. Mm-hmm. So that's one reason we know from research that homework can make the differences among children bigger. But maybe you can go for another option. In the leaflet, we can also see if you make homework classes for those children, then you have the best of both worlds. Mm-hmm. And this kind of information, accessible, always underpinned by good research, I think that's a good starting point. Mm-hmm. But I don't have any illusion, because I've been fighting urban myths for 15 years. And this morning, literally this morning, I opened my laptop. I went to the biggest spreading event for urban myths, and that's LinkedIn. Yeah. And there it was, the learning pyramid. Mm-hmm, so it keeps spreading, it keeps spreading. COVID is gone, learning myths never will die.
I could really recommend our listeners to check in on the Education Endowment Foundation in England, because to see how they present results for teachers is really impressive, I think. It's good work.
It's better than how John Hattie used to do it. No bad thing about John Hattie. Mm-hmm. But in the latest version of his book, something is missing, deliberately, I think. There is no ranking anymore.
No. Deliberately. Yes, very deliberately.
We asked him.
Yeah, we asked
him. Okay, great. Because people started looking at what has the biggest effect, but sometimes low-hanging fruit can be also worthwhile. And if you look at the Education Endowment Foundation, you see 3 elements. Mm-hmm. You see what is the learning effect expressed in months, but also how strong is the evidence. Mm-hmm. And the third, how expensive is the cost. Mm-hmm. Because, for instance, take growth mindset. We know on average, a growth mindset approach has little to no effect. We know this. Actually, we know this also from research by Carol Dweck herself. But on average, it has close to no effect. But we know for some children, it can have a negative effect. Not the pregnant children, but the... yeah, I'm stuck to the leaflet.
Yeah.
No, but for children who are actually a bit older and children who are excellent performers, they can feel insulted by growth mindset approach. Mm-hmm. But basic math, if the average is small or none, and you have a group with a negative effect, you can already imagine that you also have a group with a positive effect. And that's true. Not a huge effect, but a younger children from a non-local background can have a small but positive effect. And then you say, yeah, but it's a small effect. Yeah, but it doesn't cost any cent. It doesn't cost a lot of effort. And by introducing this kind of thinking, I think teaching becomes more realistic. The expectations of science become more realistic.
Mm-hmm. So what are we talking about here? Because what I hear is that the context is extremely important. And where does the decisions need to be to make sure that a bigger municipality decides that in our municipality all schools need to do this because we've heard this is good?
Okay.
So is it possible to flip the system? Because that's kind of what I hear.
Oh, that's a very difficult question, because now you are getting close to something that's more ideological than science. And you can have some science about saying, yeah, you have to start again. I do think I've been to a lot of countries where you have a very centralized educational system. I'm coming from the most decentralized educational system in the world. We are now introducing for the very, very, very first time central tests, but those central tests are only being used to measure the quality of the schools and never will be published. And that's a revolution. No, really.
The basis for the Belgian system is that everyone has the right to start a school.
Yeah.
Right?
And everybody can choose freely which school their children are going to. So our Secretary of Education actually has nothing to tell us about education. But everybody goes to a school, almost everybody, 99.5%, goes to a school funded by the government. Even the Catholic schools...
Without any control at all.
No, there's a bit of control.
Oh, yeah.
So we have a lot of different school systems, and school actually were a breeding ground for new ideas. And I think that the irony is, everybody's always talking about Finland, how good it was. Flanders was as good,
yes.
but we weren't able to sell it in the same way.
You didn't have Passi Salvei.
No, we didn't wrote a book, Flemish lessons, because it wouldn't sell.
Were you visible in Pisa, or were you collected?
No, we were collected together
with the French.
In the French-speaking part, but Flanders was a very great region. And then the reason people used to explain why we were so good was that liberty, that freedom. And now people are using the same as an explanation why we are doing so bad.
I know some very knowledgeable mathematics educators, researchers that have pointed out to your textbooks and stuff like that as a more reasonable explanation for the success.
Yeah, well, we will now, every time when a country sees or a region sees a decline in education, a logical reaction is more control.
Yeah.
But we have a very complicated country, so more control is impossible because it's in the constitution that education is free, in different meanings of free. So now we will have a control on the textbooks. And I do think that's a good thing, because I don't say our textbooks are bad, but nobody as a teacher can tell if a program is good or bad. They don't have any view on the quality. And so that there will be kind of quality control is a good way, but it's actually a workaround, because our school leaders, our educational leaders can't say, you have to teach this way. And then the teacher will say, really? I don't think so.
but because time is running so fast. No, it's no problem. But I want to ask you, because you also wrote a book about good teaching. I mean, so what is good teaching?
That's...
We've all been, wanting to...
Yeah, and
just tell us.
Just tell us. Tell us what works so we can go home and do it. There are many definitions, and there are a lot of discussions about what is good teaching. But I want to go back to Larry Cuban, who described the grammar of education. And the grammar of education is that one person who knows more about a certain subject goes on a trip with one or more other persons who don't know the subject yet. And by the end of the road, they know more. That's a very basic thing, but it has been a constant for the past millennia. That's education. And there's a second constant, is people doubting this is a good idea. Because people always think, but should that one person know more? Should he or she be a teacher? Shouldn't he or she be a coach? We always have those doubts, but in the end, you always result in that same grammar. So the grammar is a constant. People doubting the grammar is also a constant. And for me, I think if you take this grammar of education, if the person at the end didn't learn anything, didn't know more about the subject, didn't change in a good way, then you don't have good education. But that's a very basic thing, because there can be very harsh ways to teach people. And I don't think that's a good idea. But then you come with a very important question. There is one phrase in education that I really hate. Yeah, the child is in the center of our educational. Yeah, what child? No, really. Ask yourself, what child? Because the present child or the future child? Let me explain this. I was raised by grandparents who had a candy store. So I literally was the kid who grew up in a candy store. For everybody who thinks it's great, you're correct. and my grandmother, who died last year, she always put the present child center. So every time when I asked my grandmother, can I have a candy bar? She said yes. And the present child really loved it. The older child had needed a couple of years to lose 20 kilos. So, but already asking this little phrase, which child are you talking about, makes clear that a very simple phrase as we are pupil-centered, we are children-centered, it doesn't say anything. Because most of the time, a school is not only responsible for one child, but for a lot of children. And that's a second complication, because one of the most difficult things a school needs to do is expel a student. And everybody feels this as a failure. The school feels this is a failure because we had to let a student go. And quite often I get phone calls from journalists, because if there's a case that the parents are really angry and they talk to the media, I always explain to the journalists who call me, you have to understand that school can't tell you the reason why, because they are feeling responsible for the child that is being expelled. And they want to take into account the privacy of that child. But at the same time, that school is responsible for the learning of everybody in that school. So if one child is hurting the learning process, or even worse, physically hurting other children, then the school has to make a very difficult decision. But again, that's a limit to the idea of we are pupil-centered, we are child-centered, because it should be children-centered, because a school works with a lot of students, a lot of pupils. And that's why I think that the phrase, coming back to the question, what is good education? I've given you two examples of a phrase that is often used to describe good education. I've given you two examples to make clear how difficult it is to describe it. The good news is, I don't think there's only one way of good education. I'm convinced, I've seen a lot of schools around the globe who could be as different as possible, but I thought, wow, great schools. I'm not sure that I, as a teacher, would love to teach in every single school, because some were closer to what I like to do as a teacher. I don't know if I would put my child in every single school, but I would never dare to say that they weren't good schools.
I think it's interesting. I have two things. If you look around the world about the school, the construction, the idea how school is constructed, you can see that school is constructed the same way everywhere. So basically, it's an idea that works.
That's
the basic foundation is this is an idea that works, given the cost frames that we have on it. That's the first idea. The other idea is that most people look at PISA results and they're looking, we're bad, we're good, we are down, we are up, we're here, we are there. The real magic about PISA results, I think, is that all these countries, so many countries, if they spend so much money on education, they hover around the 500 points mark. Mm-hmm. I mean, if you put a responsible, educated person in a room with the responsibility for kids and young people, they will basically, in most times, do a good job. And then it comes the question, how can we do it better? How can we take care of everything? But there is an inherent functionality in the system, I would argue.
Yeah, well, that you've described the grammar of education in a way again, and I think it's true. At the same time, there are things that, for instance, Finland, the Netherlands, and Flanders have seen the steepest decline of all participating countries and regions. So you shouldn't be listening to me because I'm doing a bad job, it seems.
Yeah.
So we have to pose the question about social media and computers and stuff, because a lot of people, maybe policymakers and journalists mostly, do a strong connection.
But also researchers in Finland, interestingly.
Yeah, I know. But at the same time, if you look at England, I'm not saying the UK, but England and Ireland, those two regions / country has seen the opposite evolution as the three countries and regions I just mentioned. And the children in Ireland and England are also using social media, are also using computers. We know that computers can benefit learning. We know that computers can hinder learning. There is one study that I mentioned in the book, The Ingredients of Great Teaching, that made an overview of 318 effect sizes of web-based learning. And it ranges from minus 1.25 effect size, minus 1.25, to plus 1.25. So it's the difference between needing more than 2 years to teach the subject of a year to needing less than 5 months using technology. So the question shouldn't be, can we use technology or not? The question always needs to be, when will we use technology? For what will we use technology? With which students will we use technology? But that's a more nuanced, that's a more difficult question, actually. And for me, if you look at the panic, the moral panic that exists around smartphones and social media, can it have a negative effect? Yes. But if we look at a lot of the research, it's, as always, more complicated than a lot of people think. We know, for instance, that young people also find a lot of support among each other through social media. Does a cell phone hinder learning while you're studying? Yes. If you get a message, you lose your attention, it's a bad thing. But for instance, if you are a student guidance person and you send sometimes a small message how you're doing, we know also from research that small little interaction can have a huge impact, positive impact on the student well-being. So again, also here we can see, and for instance, a study that was published 3 weeks ago, where 30 schools were compared, 10 schools with a very strict regime on social media and cell phones, and 20 schools who were just having an average regime. Cell phones weren't allowed during class, but afterwards they were. But they found no differences at all in the effect of a strict regime versus the regime but less strict, because the students compensated the social media use afterwards. So again, sorry, but it's a bit more complicated than a lot of people think.
So what would be, but your role as an expert and writing all these books, so what would be your advices for a novice, for a new teacher, and for a very seasoned, well-experienced? So for those two extremes, the new teacher and the old teacher, what comes into your mind then? For
new teachers, I think I would advise 2 elements. One, I'm actually stealing from John Hattie, who told me once, years ago, when we were both young and attractive, was that make sure you have 5 didactical approaches that you can do without thinking. That you have a kind of backbone, of, a net to rely on. So you know if something goes wrong, now I can do this without thinking. Make sure you have 5 didactical approaches that are ready to use. This will help you to experiment further. Because if some experiment fails, you have something to go back to. And I think that's a good thing. I'm not saying stick to those 5 approaches for the rest of your life. No, not at all. That's just the opposite I just said. And then, because I'm an experienced teacher myself, I'm still teaching. That's when Secretary of Education in Flanders asked me to start the Flemish version of education endowment foundation. I said on one thing that I need to do this, and that is I only want to do it 3 days a week because I still want to teach. I'm love doing research and teach. That's why I'm working at the University of Utrecht, and I'm still teaching after 25-ish years. And don't be too reassured. Something that I'm still doing is that sometimes I record my own class just for the privacy reasons, just the sound, to check, for instance, how well my instructions still are. Just to check if I'm still doing okay, because sometimes you can become so self-assured, so reliant on your experience. Yeah, but everybody needs that little checkup, and that's a good thing. And the other thing is, try to share your experiences, but do tell them that you're not sure why it worked, because I just explained that's the most difficult question to answer.
That is very, very true.
We need to wrap this up. Could I make the conclusion that a great advice is just for a teacher or a principal or whatever, never stop being curious about what you're doing?
Yeah, but otherwise you die.
Okay, it's a good advice then.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Pedro de Bruyckere. Can we have a round of applause from the room? We really enjoyed talking to you.
Yes.
You're welcome. It was my pleasure.
Thank you. You've just heard, I think it's the 98th episode
coming up to the 100th.
Kornhall Netz. Yes, we're coming up to 100. We are very happy to be able to do this, to invite interesting people who knows a lot about education and talk to them, because we learn so much. And we hope you do as well as our listeners. Thank you very much for today. See you soon again.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye.